Hello, welcome to a new calculator tutorial for the TI-84 Plus. Today we'll be discussing how to use I-Var Stats in the TI-84 and 83 calculator. It is one of the most useful commands that you will be using for a majority of your statistics life, at least in most classes. I-Var Stats, or one variable statistics, is incredibly useful in order to calculate some of the most used values in summary statistics. So, what we first want to do before we can use the function, we have to have some data. So, I have some data already stored in my lists here. So if I go to Stat, which is where my lists are located, I have a few options here: Edit, Sort A, Sort D, Clear List, and Setup Editor. My option Edit is how I access my lists. And here I have a few lists made. My first list, L1, is made up of about 35 random values between 1 and 15. So we're going to calculate some stats on that. I also have some lists over here, list 3 and list 4. List 3 contains values from 1 through 12 in numeric order, and list 4 contains some frequencies for each of those values. So we're going to be using I-Var Stats for both a single set of data and also frequency data to show you how that is done. Okay, so once I have my information in my list and I know where they are, list 1 and list 3 and 4 for the frequency data, I can quit out of this back to the main screen, and I can access I-Var Stats in a very similar way. Click on the Stat button, and I have the three tabs: Edit, Calc, and Tests. And I want to access the Calc tab, so I move over once to the right, and I-Var Stats is the first option available for me. Do not select II-Var Stats if you're going to be doing frequency data. I want to make a note of that now because I see a lot of mistakes with students trying to access II-Var Stats for frequency data when it only is talking about a single variable, just a lot of them. Still, we're going to be using I-Var Stats. So we access I-Var Stats. I hit enter, and my calculator, the TI-84 Plus C, does have a wizard for this, meaning that it asks specifically for each prompt. The first option is for the list of my values, which I thankfully do already have in list 1. The second option, freq list, or frequency list, is asking for the list of frequencies, if I have one. If I do not have a list of frequencies, then I'm going to leave it as it is. I'm going to leave it blank. Or if I have something here, I'm going to delete it so I-Var Stats doesn't accidentally throw an error or try to use a frequency list that doesn't correlate with the data that I'm looking at. So here I have list, freq list, and calculate. If you do not have this wizard, I will show in a moment what it looks like if you access I-Var Stats without a wizard. So we hit calculate, and it will throw it onto my main screen, and I get a lot of data here. So let's pick apart this one by one. The first one, X bar, that's indicating sample mean. The I-Var Stats assumes that the data you have is a sample, so we use X bar instead of mu to indicate the mean. If your values are actually population, though, assume that this is the letter mu for population mean. They're calculated in the same way, though, so that's why they don't have two different rows. The second value here, sum of x, or capital sigma x, this is showing the total sum of all my values added together, which apparently is 265. 35 values of 15, yeah, that makes about sense. So this would be useful if you needed to hand calculate mean and for other circumstances. The third value here, sum of x squared, that is the sum of each of my values after they have each been individually squared. That's useful if you're trying to do hand calculations for something like a regression, where you do need to have the squared values all summed up together. However, very often we don't do regression by hand anymore, but that's there for those purposes. The next two are important, Sx and sigma x, and this is a lowercase sigma. This is indicating sample mean and population mean respectively. So Sx indicates sample mean, and sigma x represents population mean. The reason this X is there is saying that this is the sample of my X values. That's all that means. Very often we indicate sample standard deviation just with the letter S. You'll notice in every instance when you do sample standard deviation and population standard deviation, the sample standard deviation is always slightly larger. Here it's 4.25 and the population standard deviation is 4.19. That should always hold true. In terms of which one we should be using, it depends on your data. If you have a sample data, you should be using S sub X for sample standard deviation. If your data is assumed to be a population, then you can use the population standard deviation. If we scroll down, we get more information. And it scrolls down all the way until the bottom arrow disappears. I have n equals 35. That indicates the number of values in my set. That's what n indicates in all of statistics. And then I have my 5-number summary here. Useful if I need to make a box plot or if I need to help identify outliers. One of the ways, anyway. I have the minimum X, I have the maximum X, and in between are the 3 quartiles. Quartile 1, the median, otherwise known as quartile 2, and quartile 3, which is 11. So this gives us a lot of summary data. It's one of the most useful tools in this calculator. Make sure you know how to use it. Okay, so we have I-Var Stats done for normal data. Now, if you don't have a wizard, what you will have instead is this. When you hit I-Var Stats, instead of a wizard popping up, I-Var Stats itself will show up on the main screen like this with your cursor afterward. It's asking for you to give a prompt. In this case, we wanted to do I-Var Stats on list 1, so I need to access list 1, which I can hit with the number 1. If you see above it in blue is L1. So I can hit second, color-coded, 1, and I can get L1 in there. I can do the same thing if I need to access L6, which is in or right above the number 6. It's a nice little thing to keep in mind. Then, when I hit enter, it will run I-Var Stats. This will happen to you if you have TI-83s, and I have seen some select brands, some really early 84s, that don't necessarily have the wizard. But I think every other 84 that I've seen, not necessarily the pluses, still have the wizard for you, which is nice. Okay, so we have everything there. Now, what I want to try to do, again, if you look back at my lists, we did list 1 summary statistics. Now let's do the summary statistics on frequency data. So this is when the data has already been summed down a little bit and counted per each value. So here I have each of my individual values in list 3 and the frequencies in list 4, indicating that there are 2 values or 2 people that responded with a number 1. There's 1 respondent with a number 2. There's 4 respondents with a number 3, and so on and so forth. And we can calculate the data on this without having to list it as 1, 1, 2, 3, 3, 3, 3, 4, etc., 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 listing out each repetition. We can keep it as frequency data. All right, so list 3 and list 4. So I'll quit out of this, and we're going to access I-Var Stats as we had before. We're going to hit Stat and go over to Calc to I-Var Stats. Now here, again, my list of numbers, the actual values, is in list 3. My frequency list I have in list 4. So this time I am going to give it 2 prompts. The next time you use I-Var Stats, make sure that if it only has a list, that you delete anything that you have listed for frequency list, or you may get thrown an error. But here I have my list in place. I hit calculate. It'll take a couple seconds, and bam, I have my information. Again, I have my mean, my sum of data, my sum of squares, my sample and population standard deviation respectively, the number of values, the minimum, the quartile 1, median, quartile 3, and maximum. All the values are still here. I have seen some students do frequency data in this, and then the sample standard deviation doesn't show up. What that usually means is that you're missing one value, or the one list doesn't match up with another list in terms of the length. Maybe you have 12 points of data in one list, but only 11 in another. That's probably what happens. But regardless, I still get my data calculated rather nicely. That is I-Var Stats, one of the most useful things in a TI calculator. You will be using it in a lot of your statistics classes, so be sure you can access it on the fly. You will want to use this very often so you can save yourself a lot of headache to calculate not just the mean, which can be done pretty nicely, but the sample standard deviation or population standard deviation. Those take a lot of calculative work, so it's very nice that we have this technology to do it for us. All right, that is everything that I wanted to talk about with I-Var Stats. If you have any questions on it or you're getting some errors, feel free to put comments in the video description or the video itself. And if you are one of my students, feel free to just come up and talk to me and I'll see what I can do to help. All right, see you in the next video.